Hello, everybody, and welcome back to I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. Gavin, I heard the internet connection got beefed up.
I mean, sort of.
In
So
the most
last week,
nerdy way possible.
I'm confused now. What are you referring to?
I'm referring to the thing you told me not 30 seconds before we started recording.
Oh, okay, yeah. So last week, the hotel that I've been staying at and recording at for pretty much the entire podcast since September, um, we've been staying at a different hotel. But then last week it was booked up, so I had to move to a different hotel. So we'd been at a Quality Inn the whole time. Last week I had stayed at Days Inn. It seemed much sketchier, and there was literally zero cell service at all in my room last week. So I'm like, oh, fine, I guess I'll get a VPN. And like, I really should have had one the whole time.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so we're not sponsored, by the way. So I happen to be using ExpressVPN, and I'm happy with it so far. Um, Although I
Good
tried
stuff.
using private internet access, which is one that one of my favorite tech YouTube channels does ads for somewhat frequently. But they just like wouldn't take my money. Like I tried signing up for it
Sounds
and
like a
making
great
an
business
account.
model to have.
Right. Like you think if a company wants anything, it's your money. I
It's
take that
money.
back because Facebook doesn't really want your money. They want your data. Like most big
Well,
companies.
you are the money to them, but
Exactly. But yeah, they just wouldn't take my money, and I'm like, fine, I'll use ExpressVPN, which is a little more expensive, and I'm sure has very similar features, but whatever.
well, I am glad that you
Anyway,
are now protected as we continue on to our 61st podcast journey here. I was
yeah,
told there were
now
some
now I
updates
can
for the
watch.
situation that we talked about last week.
I was gonna say now I can watch like UK Netflix as well. That's another benefit of having a VPN. But
I mean, is there anything that you really want to watch on UK Netflix?
not that I'm aware of currently, but I also haven't looked. So
It's one of those things. I'm not saying I'm going to use that feature, but it's a bonus.
yeah, exactly.
All right, so what do we got for updates?
Yeah, so if you remember last episode, at the beginning we spent a decent amount of time talking about a particular fossil track site. So, you know, fossils of dinosaur tracks, a site on Bureau of Land Management, BLM land, in Utah that was damaged by some construction activities. And given that A, that's a really bad thing, and B, that's the field in which I currently work, and the reason why I'm recording out of hotels instead of my own apartment. Um, I wanted to talk about it. So the story has been updated a bit, or at least made clearer to me, because I kept mostly seeing things through Twitter, which, as you may or may not know, is potentially not the most reliable of sources. And so there were a handful of people I kept seeing around Twitter talking about it, and I'm like, and they seemed like they knew a lot about it, but I'm like, I don't know who you are. So it's not like their name jumped out at me, or like what, you know, if they were like actually connected with the site in any way. But a really great article came out in Gizmodo, which we'll link down in the show notes, that really lays out exactly what happened, and sort of potentially what might happen with it going forward. That's kind of up in the air, but bit of an update. So long story short, there was the site was like, you know, signs and a boardwalk and things were put there in 2016 so people could come visit it and see it, because it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, but it's right off a major highway, so it's not way out there. And so some signs were put up so people could go visit it and have information to read. And so but you know, 5 now 6 years is a long time for a wooden boardwalk to be sitting out in the Utah desert, and it was damaged.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the boards got warped and things. And I guess in October, the BLM field office based out of Moab, Utah, put something on their website basically saying, hey, some of these boards are warped. It's a tripping hazard. We want to fix it. And that's pretty much the extent of what it said, to my knowledge. And then I think the last week in January or so, so about a week ago, 10 days ago, um, a concerned citizen who is involved, just like I believe he's like an investment banker based out of Utah, whose son is very interested in paleontology, so he cares a lot about paleontology. Um, Basically, he was looking for recent paleontology news to talk with his son about, and happened to look at the BLM website and see that there was a notification about construction going on at this site, and he thought that was weird. So he sent an email to the BLM, got nothing back. He talked to some paleontologists that he knew who reached out to the BLM. They got nothing back. And he's like, I'm going to go and just see what's happening. And he got there, and there sat a bulldozer or backhoe, whatever terminology you prefer, sitting on the tracks themselves. And obviously, he's like, "Oh no, this is real bad." Um, so he's the one who I was sort of seeing around Twitter, where I'm like, because I like even looked at his Twitter bio, and there was nothing about paleontologies, and I'm like, who is this person? Um, so he was just a concerned Utah citizen, you know, trying to figure out what is happening here. And so some people got more involved. People started, talking about it and posting pictures on Twitter, and it kind of exploded from there, involving one of the people who did art that is like on the signs and things at there. So he was like commissioned by the BLM and paid by the BLM to make art and understand this site. Um, and so some of the tracks were destroyed, and the BLM has sort of been very wishy-washy and politicky about some of their answers regarding things, um, which is very frustrating for me, because I work with the BLM. Granted, I think I've only had like one conversation with somebody from the BLM, and even then, that person was not there to talk to me. So they had other things to be doing. So they basically said before any more construction takes place at this site, a BLM regional paleontologist will come and conduct like an assessment and basically see what happened and how we can preserve the tracks going forward. I don't know how much teeth that's going to have, but a big thing that many people pointed out that I didn't know until probably like a couple days ago was that the regional paleontologist like position for that area of Utah is empty. They do not have one. And
Didn't
yeah,
we talk about how like you need to have one? Wasn't that like part of what your whole
so
job is?
yes, on site, yes, but like the a paleontologist like actually employed by the federal government out of that region of like the BLM's district. They're supposed to have one. So a person who I've never met them, but I've interacted with them on Twitter, and I know people who knows them. A person named Rebecca Hunt Foster. She was in that position until 2018. She now is the head paleontologist at Dinosaur National Monument in Utah and Colorado. And so, but since 2018, and granted, I don't know when within the year she left, but at least 3-4 years ago, they've just not replaced her.
Hmm.
And so a bunch of people were like, maybe this wouldn't have happened if you had a paleontologist on your staff like you're supposed to.
Yeah, it seemed. I don't know. That seems like a number of people just kind of falling down on the job. On the plus side, though, Gavin, if you're looking for a new gig,
Oh, I'm not qualified for that.
are you sure?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, all right.
um,
I'll take your word for it.
yeah, should be somebody with a PhD who has more experience than I do.
All right. So you in like 2.5 years.
Oh yeah, that 2.5 year PhD.
Yeah.
um, but the biggest thing, and this is a quote from somebody who's been volunteering at this site since it was sort of commissioned. So I think she started like volunteering there. Actually, I think in 2013, so a while before a lot of the formal stuff got put up. So they said usually we're just afraid of the public being vandals, and so there have been a handful of Moab sites or different petroglyphs, cave drawings, things like that in the Moab area that have been vandalized in the last couple of years. It's actually really sad. Um, But they said, usually we're just afraid of the public being vandals. That's who you always think you're protecting these sites from. Just to find out that it's a bumbling mishap by the BLM is just disappointing and frightening. We need a paleontologist here.
I have nothing to add except for, yeah, you do. And you needed one like a month ago.
Right. So very frustrating. But several, different organizations have been involved. Several like paleontology focused nonprofits, and also whatever the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology is. I don't know if that's technically a nonprofit or not, but it's very important society in vertebrate paleontology. They've gotten involved. Several politicians of Utah have gotten involved. So hopefully this kind of thing won't happen again. Any more updates, and I will let you know. But
well, thank you for
so
the
also,
updates.
so
not,
I will be
not exciting, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so we'll be linking that Gizmodo article down below, as well
Perfect.
as a Twitter thread if you want to submit, because the Inspector General of the Department of Interior, so the Department of Interior is the federal department that oversees the BLM. They have like and just general open complaint hotline. So there will be also a Twitter thread if you feel so inclined to write a complaint. The instructions on how to do that will also be down below.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. And I suppose on with our regularly scheduled programming now.
Yeah, absolutely. So today is February 9th. Mike, what happened today?
So I'm actually going to give you a year. I want to see how close you can get with me giving you the year. Just rapid fire. Don't think
Sure.
too much about it. I'm going to give you a year. The year is 1964.
1964. The Voting Rights Act was 65. So Civil Rights Act?
So you're correct. Civil rights is 64. However, that's not even close to what I'm talking about here.
Oh, okay.
You have the right year, but not the right day. Not what we're talking about.
Okay, what do we got?
Well, give me two more guesses. I guess I had three guesses.
Oh, geez. 64. Other than that, I don't know.
Nothing. All right. So
I
in
got nothing.
1964. I will admit that I am not quite as well read on this as many other people, but on February 9th, 1964, 73.7 million people tuned into the Ed Sullivan Show to watch the Beatles play on the Ed Sullivan Show, which is sort of how the Beatles got, or at least part of how the Beatles got introduced to the United States and beginning that Beatlemania that took place. And you can still see the clips on YouTube and just see, even in 1964, just how talented these guys were and how they were able to just really attract a crowd. And they're all also like, shaved at that point, which is kind of cool, especially seeing what they all looked like by the end of their actual time. But yeah, February 9th, 1964, the Beatles are on Ed Sullivan, which is a, kind of one of those cool pop culture moments in history.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like, if I had to pick a year, 64 probably would have been up there. If someone was like, what year did they go on Ed Sullivan? It probably would have been in the ballpark. But that was not at all what I was thinking.
There was lots of other stuff going on in the 60s.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But yeah, that was kind of what I had, a little off the beaten path for us, but something still interesting nonetheless.
Yeah.
So, Gavin, what do we got for our main course today?
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about a group of animals that is really, really interesting. A group of animals that is studied a lot and is fairly well understood, at least in terms of fossils. Most people around today do not like regular people don't really understand them. They're just afraid of them.
Correct.
So today we're going to be talking about crocodilians. Their fossil history, what we have around today, and just some neat examples through time. So, Mike, what is a crocodilian?
Man, I don't know. Crocodilian. Somewhat amphibious creatures. I know we've talked about, the complications of that term, but like I feel like they're more reptile than anything, but they spend most of their time in water because of locomotion. Like they can't walk well on land or can't move around well, but they still have to breathe air.
Mm-hmm.
Um, four legs, long tail, big. We all know crocodiles and alligators, although I couldn't tell you the difference for the life of me.
We'll talk
Um,
about it.
I am sure we are going to get there. I'm imagining this is one of those things, and again, we talked about why this is a horrific term, but living fossil comes to mind. Something that,
I was hoping you might say that because we'll talk
yeah,
about that a bit too.
I am looking forward to. I'm imagining it's something that maybe hasn't evolved. Um, it looks the same. Let me try and phrase this a little bit more in the spirit of this show. Um, you know, looks the same way now as it did many years ago. But what makes a crocodile a crocodile? I that's a difficult one. It's definitely one of those you know it when you see it.
Yeah, crocodilians are very much like our rhinos or elephants episodes, where it's like kind of weird that you need to describe it because everyone just kind of knows what it is. They're very popular in media. They're very popular in zoos. Um,
They're very
you
popular in
know,
Florida.
very popular in Florida. Weirdly, because it's the only place where alligators and crocodiles overlap, to my knowledge.
Really?
Yes, and
Huh.
sort of.
Okay.
We'll talk about it. So a crocodilian is a member of the group Crocodilia. That's why they're called that. Um, and they are large, mostly aquatic reptiles. Uh, in fact, the largest species of crocodilians are the largest reptiles on the planet,
Okay.
which, considering, and we'll talk about sizes a bit, um, but they're smaller than you think and also relatively sad compared to some big reptiles of the past. Um, but like you said, they are generally seen as like archaic, like they're really old and ancient and like living fossils, but that is not at all true. They have very complex anatomy,
Mm-hmm.
and so we're going to go into that anatomy a little bit. But the general body shape is sort of like a lizard, but more thick, I guess. And I don't mean that at all in like the multiple C's way of thick. I mean just like generally chunkier than you think of with like most lizards.
Okay.
So they have their tail that is laterally compressed, meaning that it's sort of tall up and down instead of side to side. So it's much more like a shark tail than a dolphin tail, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. Um, and they use that to swim. Most crocodilians are very aquatic, to some of them being amphibious is a good word that you used, because amphibious just means does pretty well inland and on water, which is definitely true of most crocodilians. Uh,
Is that true? When we say like does well on land, it was always my understanding that they just couldn't move very well on land. Like they
no,
could do it, but
they can move quite well on land.
really, okay.
Some of them are less good. But there's actually been lots of studies about their locomotion because, for the most part, like I said, they have the general lizard body shape with the legs sort of sprawled out to the side. And for the most part, that's what they do. They'll just kind of slide along their belly, but they absolutely can do. There's sort of a low walk, which is that, and then it's called their high walk, where they can pick themselves up and put their legs underneath their body, like you would think of with like a mammal. Like your legs are
Huh.
directly underneath your body, and walk like that. And if they
Okay.
really need to get somewhere, a lot of the smaller species actually sort of gallop.
Really?
Yes,
Really? Huh. Okay.
where like the back legs come up and sort of like a spring sort of like motion, the back legs come
Hmm.
forward and they push like you would think of like a horse galloping, obviously not nearly as like elegant. They look a little clumsy when they do it, but they can move surprisingly fast on land and are very capable on land as well.
Okay.
They prefer to do most of their things in the water because that's what they're more adapted for. They like to hide in the water and then surprise their prey like that. Or some of them just eat fish. And it's like, well,
Really? I
fish
guess
live
that
in the water, so
yeah, that seems to make sense. Now, how long are they able to stay completely under the water? Because they still have to breathe air pretty regularly, right?
yeah. And so that kind of depends what studies you look at back in the day. So a lot of the numbers that you'll see are old numbers, and by old I mean just like they've been around for a while, and that's mostly because people would like tie weights to alligators and see when it died. Um,
That's kind of like what
so
they
it
used to do with witches in Salem.
kind of so it's like you'll see like, oh, like half an hour. It's like, well, yeah, probably. And I didn't see that number anywhere. That's just a number I just kind of pulled out of nowhere. But it's like they'll mostly hang out at the surface. Um, they will dive and stuff, and we'll talk about some of the mechanics of how they do that because it's actually really interesting.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, so let's talk about some of their anatomy because, like I said, they superficially look like lizards, but they have much more in common with birds for a reason that we'll talk about.
Okay.
So they have very complex breathing and circulatory systems. Those are the two big things that are very complex about them. Their breathing system is a lot like a bird's, in that it's not quite as efficient as birds. So birds, when they breathe, I guess let's talk about when humans breathe. So we breathe in and we breathe out. And when we do that, the air sort of mixes, so it goes in and out the same way.
By the way, everybody, you're now breathing manually. Congratulations.
Yes. Uh, when birds breathe, it is unidirectional. So it's like a loop.
Oh,
They breathe in, it goes into a sac. That goes from like a sac probably to a bunch of other sacs, but then eventually goes to the lungs, to another sac, and then out. A
does
different
it go
way
in
than it
and
came in.
does it go in and out of like the same hole, like nostrils, or does it go like in the nostrils and out the mouth?
So their nostrils are separated in a certain way that the air does not mix when they breathe in and
Huh.
out. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So, and it's not even really like they have like an in and out like you think of it because it is
Mhm.
unidirectional.
So are they able to just like breathe continuously, like you and I
Pretty
have to take
much.
breaths? Are they just able to continue breathing?
More or less. Yeah.
Wow.
And
Wow.
so crocodilians have a less efficient version of that, but a version of that.
Okay.
Um, so they are extremely efficient at breathing. Um, and they also weirdly, so you have a diaphragm muscle underneath your lungs that is how you breathe. You
Hmm.
know, it's just like a sheet of muscle that flexes down toward your stomach when you breathe in, and then flexes back up toward your ribs and your lungs when you breathe out. That is an exclusive mammal thing. Only mammals have that. Other vertebrates do that in different ways. Lizards just use muscles along their ribs to just expand their rib cage, and then that just sort of pulls air in because there's now like negative pressure inside.
Hmm.
What crocodilians do is they have muscles that attach from their pelvis to their liver, and when they want to breathe in, it sort of pulls the liver toward the hips, and when they breathe out, it relaxes and the liver moves back toward the lungs. So they use their liver as a diaphragm.
When you said
It's
liver, I thought you
weird.
misspoke at first. That's wow.
Nope.
Okay.
Nope. Turtles do something also weird, but that's a different conversation. Weird but similar. But yeah, so that's instead of having a diaphragm, they were like, "Well, we got this liver in here. Why not? It's sort of in the right place." Uh,
Hmm.
um, their circulatory system, so how they get their blood from their heart to everywhere else in their body, I've seen cited several times as the most complex invertebrates. They have the most complex circulatory system in any vertebrate. Crocodilians do.
Really?
Yeah. And that mostly comes down to they have lots of shunts throughout all of their body. So they can just sort of shut off blood to a certain place without, screwing up their blood flow. And
Okay.
we sort of do that. So, like when you're cold, your body will restrict blood flow to your limbs to help preserve it in your body so it doesn't cool you down. That mostly is muscles in your capillaries closing. So there's like little rings of muscle in your capillaries out in your hands and your arms and stuff that then close. They just have like trap doors sort of throughout their circulatory system that they can just close. Specifically, when they are diving, and I've seen this where it's like, we don't know for sure that this is why they do it or why they have it, but it's what I learned in my anatomy classes. But so when they're diving, they just shut off blood flow to their lungs. They're like, well, I'm not using them. Why would I want blood there?
I mean, okay, efficient.
Yeah.
Wild, but okay.
And so another thing that they do that makes them really efficient, potentially for diving, is our muscle cells have what's called myoglobin, which is, so hemoglobin is the compound in your red blood cells that holds oxygen. In your muscle cells, you have myoglobin, which sort of stores it to be used later. They don't have this. Instead, they basically just have, they will change the pH of their blood to make, because, certain compounds only work at a certain pH. So they will release bicarbonate, which is an ion, and that will change the pH of their blood. And hemoglobin will just release all of its oxygen when it gets to that pH. And so they can just instantly like have a ton of free oxygen for their muscles to use. That very creative solution to a problem
why can't we do that?
I mean, it's used for different things. We have different kinds of muscles than reptiles generally do. That's a different conversation that we don't have time to go into right now, because crocs are real cool, and I want to talk more about crocs.
Okay, let's do it.
So those are the big things that I'm like, they are just way more complex than people think they are. Even their behavior is a lot more complex. There's been some studies that have claimed, and there's been lots of follow-ups that are like, we don't know for sure that this isn't what they're doing, but maybe tone it down a bit. So, but of some potential tool use in crocodilians, where during the nesting season of certain birds that live in their habitat, they will bounce sticks on their nose. And when the bird comes to pick up the stick to build its nest, they will try and eat the bird.
Impressive.
Yeah, so they're using the stick as like a lure to get the bird to come close.
How well does that work?
I don't remember. Not super well, which is one of the reasons why people were like, if this was what they were doing, they'd probably either be better at it, or we'd like...
Or there'd be less of them.
Right. It wouldn't be selected for if it is working at the percentage that we see it working.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that's part of the reason why people were like, maybe. But very complex behaviors. And you can even train them. Crocodiles are actually quite trainable. A lot of places
that do tricks?
No, but things like, to keep them from running up to, like, if people are keeping them in like a zoo or something, anytime, basically to prevent them from associating people with food, they will train them. So it's like, I hold up this thing. That means food. If you don't see this thing, you're not being fed. So it's like, if the person walks in, they're just super chill, don't really react to them. But if they walk in and hold up whatever object they used to train it, then they're like, oh yeah, food time.
That's wild. I would love to be the first person to go in there and be like, oh yeah, let's see if crocodiles are trainable. How would you like to have that job?
Oh, man. But yeah, and there's even some stories of crocodiles being able to like learn their names.
Wow.
Whether they react to it, it's probably like your cat. They'll hear you and be like, maybe I'll come, maybe. But they are much more complex than people give them credit for generally. So with that, let's get into some of the modern diversity. And in our notes, I listed out most of them. There are too many to name, unlike the rhino episode where there's, I think, like 5 or 6 species of rhino. Elephants, there was only 3. With manatees, there was only 4. So for crocodilians, there are, depending on who you ask, 23 to 25 living species. And so we'll talk about some of them, but I want to talk about the difference between crocs and gators. because that's generally how they're split up. Is there's the croc side of the crocodilian family tree, or crocodile side of the family tree, and then the alligator side.
Okay.
The main difference.
What's the difference here? Because this is one of those things. Here's the thing. Just a little spoiler, Gavin, and I apologize for this. You're going to tell me this, and I'm going to understand it for like 3.5 days, and I'm going to forget this. But it is something that I always like learning for the first time again and again and again.
Yeah. The big thing is their snout.
Okay.
So crocodiles have a much skinnier snout than alligators do. Crocodiles have much more of a V-shaped snout, whereas alligators have a much more U-shaped snout. But the
That's
big
enough
thing
to be a whole different thing. Like,
well, and it's also some stuff with the teeth, not in really how they're shaped, but in alligators, I guess on the alligator side, you will only see top teeth. They have a big overbite. Only the top teeth will be showing if they have their mouth closed. On the crocodile side, all of their teeth will showing. Their teeth sort of interlock. So when they have their mouth closed, if you see top and bottom, that is a crocodile.
So why is it that like there's 1,000 species of dogs and they're all dogs, just like different species, and there's just wild differences in many different things, whereas with crocodiles and alligators, it's
a lot of that with dogs is humans messing it up. Domestication and selective breeding like that is weird. If people in like a few million years would find all these dog skeletons, and for whatever reason our records of breeding them didn't like exist, then I feel like I would call them different species, like a Chihuahua and a Great Dane. I would not call them the same species. Personally.
So this is all just when we're talking about, again, classification. This is just kind of humans making a call, whether it's, whether maybe makes the most sense. It feels more right to us than any actual reason.
Well, I mean, there are actual reasons where it's like all of the crocodiles are more closely related to each other than they are to the alligators, and all the alligators are more closely related to each other. And like DNA stuff backs it up. We'll talk about DNA a bit later because there's a weird thing with DNA for a couple particular crocodilians. But
all right, let's keep going then.
Yeah, so that is generally how it's split up: the croc side and the gator side. So on the gator side, we have first the genus Alligator. Makes sense. So there are two species. The one you're thinking of is the American alligator, which is Alligator mississippiensis, that lives pretty much in the southeastern United States. Also in the genus, there is the Chinese alligator, Alligator sinensis, which only lives in a relatively small part of China. Other than that, those are the only true alligators alive today.
Okay. Are there more alligators or crocodiles? Not like total number of species, but just like total of them.
Ooh. I would say probably crocodiles.
Okay. But it's not obvious one way or the other without just looking
just because they live in a much more broad area, as we'll see. So like I said, American alligators pretty much only live in the southeastern US. They probably get down into like northern Mexico, but that's about it.
Okay.
Chinese alligator, only small part of China. Also on the alligator side, we have all of your caimans, which are alligator-like, but a little smaller, a little more generally aquatic, and have a different diet typically, and as well as some different skeletal things that we don't really have to get into. But there's the genus Cayman, which has 3 different species in it. The genus Melanosuchus, which is a single species, which is your black caiman. And the genus Paleosuchus. Suchus is, I believe, Latin for crocodile, by the way. You'll hear that quite a bit.
Okay.
Paleosuchus, which is your dwarf caimans, including one that is somewhat frequently kept as a pet, which is Cuvier's dwarf caiman.
Cuvier's dwarf caiman.
Yeah, that is the smallest living crocodilian, and it gets probably around anywhere from 4 to 5 feet long total. So for a crocodilian, pretty small.
Right.
And that is all of your alligator side. So that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 living species, or 8 living species. My apologies.
Okay.
Yeah, 8 living species today. Now, if you remember, I said there were, depending on who you asked, 23 to 25 species of crocodilians.
Yeah, I thought I
The
remembered
rest are
that.
crocs. So
Or what?
that crocs.
Okay.
That's part of
Mhm.
why I said crocodiles there's more of them, because
Right.
also, like I said, there's that 2 alligators live in China and the US. All of the Cayman live in just South and Central America. And even like the Amazon, they don't get too far south. Um, so other than that single Chinese species, they're all restricted to the Americas. On the croc side, we have, I'm not even going to list all the species because there's a lot, but there's the genus Mesotops, which is 2 species. That is the West African and Central African slender snouted crocodiles.
Okay.
The genus Osteolaemus, which is 2 species, which are the dwarf crocs of Africa.
Are they called dwarves for a reason?
They're just small.
Okay.
Not quite as small as the Cuvier's dwarf cayman, but I would say probably like 6 feet, 7 feet, maybe.
I mean,
Um,
I'm 6 or 7 feet, so yeah. All right.
right. So,
And
but
those are small.
right, yeah, exactly.
I get it.
These are big animals.
Yes. Yep.
The genus Crocodilus, which is most of your crocodiles, has 14 species. I'm not going to list all of them, but some of the highlights are Crocodilus prosus, which is the saltwater crocodile, the largest reptile on Earth today.
Mm-hmm.
And that is pretty much the only one like confirmed to like actively hunt humans. The rest will like they'll eat us if they get the chance, but it's like these have been confirmed to like be stalking people to eat them.
Okay.
So if you have any cousins from Florida, they're like, "Oh, I got hunted by an alligator the other day." Probably not.
Unlikely.
Yeah,
The alligator might have showed up at your front door, but
right. They're very curious. They really like to investigate what's going on, like sharks do. When a shark
yep.
bites stuff, it's not because they're trying to eat it. Usually, it's like, well, I don't have hands,
Mm-hmm.
so my mouth is the only thing that I can use to interact with the world. But yeah, so this genus also includes the Nile crocodile, the American crocodile, and the Morlet crocodile, which I only threw the Morlet crocodile in because that's the one that I got to see when I was down in Belize.
Okay. And how close were you when you saw it?
Oh, real close. So
Okay.
we had been sort of tubing down like a lazy river type thing during the day through like a mangrove swamp. And then that night, our guides took us out to like the same area of water and was like, everybody be quiet. And we were. And then he took out like a spotlight and shined it across the lake. And you just see a bunch of eyes just sort of, because they have it's called the tapetum lucidum. That's what makes
Mm-hmm.
animals' eyes shine back at you at night. We
Okay.
just, so many. And we were like, oh my God, you let us in that water? And they're like, they're very docile. Like they don't like people.
I'm not sure how much comfort that would be to me, because if I find out they don't like people, that almost does the opposite. It's like,
Okay,
oh,
but okay, they are afraid of people.
so they might attack.
No, they will
I,
run away. Things don't tend to attack things the same size as them. Generally, there are
hey,
exceptions for sure.
I'm
Um,
glad you have confidence in this. I'm glad you
eh,
made it out alive. That's like good for
well,
you.
yeah,
I would.
um,
Crocodiles are not something I ever want to stare down.
yeah. But then we have 2 more genera around today, and these are the weird ones that are like sort of crocs, but not really. They're closer to crocs than they are to gators, but they're not really crocs, if that makes sense. I'll explain. So we have the weirdest one, which is the Indian gharial in the genus Gavialis. It is very large, around the same size as the saltwater crocodile, maybe a little smaller. But if you've ever seen one with like a really, really skinny snout, sometimes with a big bulb on the end of the snout, that is a gharial. They eat exclusively fish. The gharial like actively will not eat much else besides fish
Mm-hmm.
because like their snout is just so fragile that it's like, well, if they tried to eat anything really bigger, if it struggled, it could just like snap their snout in half. But despite that, they're still real big. And so the other genus that's weird is the false gharial in the genus Tomistoma.
Tomistoma.
Yep. And so the false gharial also has a skinny snout, but it's a lot more tapered, much more like elongated V-shaped than the true Indian gharial, which is it gets real skinny, real fast, and then just stays skinny. So it's much more like a pipe sticking off of its face, whereas the false gharial is much more like just like I said, an elongated V off the face.
Elongated feet off the face. Okay.
Yeah. And the reason these two are weird is because based on bones and morphology, so like looking at a skeleton, looking at, mostly skeleton, but the false gharial is usually placed much more closely related to crocodiles than the Indian gharial is. So the false gharial, much more croc-like based on the bones. Based on DNA, it is kind of the opposite, where the false and the true gharial are closely related, and they are together right outside the rest of crocodiles.
So what does that leave us in terms of classification? Because don't you kind of have to make a call when you're going through that tree?
Right. And it's like, depending on who you ask, this one is like...
Okay.
Yeah, so this is why I have mentioned several times. This is one of the case studies that I use where I'm like, I don't really trust DNA stuff. Because it's like, if you look at the actual skeletal features, I don't know what they are off the top of my head, but when I was reading about them, I was like, this sounds more convincing than I know some of the problems with DNA stuff, particularly because there have been other studies with crocodilian DNA saying that like their DNA changes very slowly and has weird mutation rates, like weirdly slow. And so that just can change the way DNA studies are interpreted. I don't study these, so I don't really have an opinion either way. But as a paleontologist,
but the controversy exists.
Right. As a paleontologist, I feel honor bound to trust the bones more. So, anyway, so those are all of our living crocodilians.
Okay.
And actually, really quickly, I wanted to talk about crocodilian sizes, because that's something that you hear a lot. I've known several people from Florida who will swear that they saw like a 20-foot alligator. You did not.
Okay, so how big did they get?
So the American alligator that most people, if you are living in North America, the one you are thinking of, they get like absolute tops, like 15 feet, which is still big.
That's huge.
For sure. But
if somebody told me they saw a 20-foot alligator, and as it turns out it was 15 feet, I give them credit for that. That's much. They get perfect credit.
But it's like, that is like absolute tops, where it's like most of them would be closer to 10 to 12. Which again, as I was saying, is smaller than you probably think it is. Still big, but it's sort of like, I had a bunch of people that I knew growing up who would swear that they saw a cottonmouth snake around where I grew up, and I'm like, no, you didn't. No, you didn't. Like, as far north as they get is like very southern Pennsylvania. And I'm like, we're about 500 miles from that. So...
Not how that works.
So, the other one that I wanted to highlight for size is the saltwater crocodile, which I mentioned is the biggest reptile around today, and so obviously the biggest crocodilian.
Okay.
They get, again, topping out, the males get around 20 feet. So that is one where it's like, yeah, you probably saw a 20-footer. But the females are much smaller, generally around, that 10 to 12 foot range. So I have seen a close to 20-foot one in person. There was a reptile zoo in South Dakota when I lived there. And, ooh, boy, that was a big animal.
That was a big boy?
That was a big boy. But yeah, so just in general, don't believe your cousin from Florida.
About anything.
Yeah, pretty much. And so that's the living stuff. Let's look at some of the fossils now. That's what we're here to talk about on the podcast. So, crocs have a really good fossil record in that they're very, very diverse. They're big animals, which means they preserve pretty well. Not all of them, but a decent amount of them are, live in freshwater habitats that preserve well. Some of them are terrestrial, which we'll talk about, which is real weird for crocs today, but they were not always like this. So, a little bit about where crocodilians fit amongst all the other animals. So, reptiles broadly, we've talked about how reptiles is not a very useful taxonomic term, but for this, sort of bear with me. So, reptiles today basically consist of your lizards and snakes, crocodilians, turtles, and birds, more or less. There's a couple other, like the tuatara. There's like one, maybe two species, but they're not lizards, look a lot like... Anyway, so on one side, there is the Lepidosaurs. This would be your scaly reptiles, which today are your snakes and lizards and the tuatara. That is one side. The other side are the Archosaurs, which are your crocodilians and your birds. That's also where dinosaurs and pterosaurs fit as well. And then turtles, we don't really know what's going on with turtles. They might be archosaurs. They might be something totally different. We're not talking about turtles today. So crocodilians are on the dinosaur side of the reptile family tree. But they are not dinosaurs. You'll see that a lot in different things, particularly in zoos, where it's like, oh, they are so much like dinosaurs. And we do study crocodilians as a way to get some clues about things about how dinosaurs might have been.
That was part of what I was thinking when I brought up the whole living fossil thing and trying to cage my words a little bit more carefully.
Right.
But yeah, I definitely heard that before, and it's kind of like them and ostriches and probably one or two other animals, are frequently cited as this is as close to a dinosaur as we get.
Right. And it's like with a lot of their anatomy, it is depending on what group of dinosaurs you're looking at. On the spectrum of crocodiles and birds, it is kind of assumed that dinosaurs are somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, generally. So if you study crocodiles and birds, you can have a somewhat decent idea of what dinosaurs might have been like. So for that example, it is useful to compare crocodiles to dinosaurs. But they are on totally different sides of the archosaur tree. So within archosaurs, they basically split from the dinosaurs, at least in the very early Triassic. So that would be around 250 million years ago. They're not that closely related to dinosaurs at all. They're just what we have today.
Okay, so this is the thinnest kid, the fat cap thing. Like, they're closely related to dinosaurs based on what exists today, but what exists today isn't exactly closely related to dinosaurs.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so the big overarching crocodile side of the archosaurs is called the Pseudotsuchia, which ironically means fake crocodile. And around this time when they first show up in the early Triassic, they are almost entirely terrestrial. They're walking around on 4 legs, some of them even just walking on 2 legs, very much like dinosaurs, just cruising around the Triassic, very deserty areas of Pangaea. And you would see them today and call them a dinosaur. If one was walking around today, you would call it a dinosaur. You would not say that is a crocodile.
Okay. Really?
Yeah. So like all archosaurs, so that's a big difference between archosaurs and lepidosaurs, the lizardy reptile group, is that all archosaurs ancestrally walk like humans do, or like mammals do, in that they put the legs underneath the body instead of out to the side, like you think of with a lizard. You'll note that crocodiles have sort of reverted to being able to have their legs on the side. However, you also can do that if you feel like it, so that's not a thing that is necessarily indicative of, your ancestry per se.
Okay.
Um, like I said, there were some that were mostly bipedal. Particularly, most of these at this time were carnivorous. That has not always been the case. Um, but by the end of the Triassic, this group was very diverse, had lots of different things like some of the largest carnivores around at the time, such as Asukas. If you watched Walking with Dinosaurs, like I did as a kid, the BBC documentary, you will be familiar with Asukas. It was a very large, around 10-ish feet long, maybe a bit bigger, terrestrial crocodile cousin that looked very much like a dinosaur, but with a more slender head, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
So we had the big carnivorous ones. We had a group called the Edosaurs, which were herbivorous and armored, but still terrestrial. So they had these big, thick bones along their back to work as armor, and they had teeth for eating plants. Not really what you think of when you think of crocodilians today.
No, that's not at all what I was thinking.
Although some of them do eat fruit today. Not like entirely, but it's like they've been seen in the wild eating fruit. If they happen to come across like an apple or something, they'll eat it.
Okay.
Which surprised the heck out of me. But if you remember anything about anytime we talked about the Triassic, you might know that there was a big mass extinction at the end of it. And at the end of that extinction, all of those cool guys went extinct except for one group. That would be the Crocodilomorpha, which means crocodile shape. Although, weirdly, not the shape of crocodiles that we think of today.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
After the extinction, that sometimes taxonomy sucks, and people name things that aren't necessarily completely accurate, or it might have been accurate with the information they had at the time, but it turned out to not be correct. And whoever named the group first, that name stays. So some of these are crocodile shaped, others are very much not. Yeah, after the end Triassic extinction, because like I said, dinosaurs were around before the end Triassic extinction, but they were just sort of, they weren't like the major dominant players in pretty much any ecosystem. But after the end Triassic, going into the Jurassic period, they very much were. Dinosaurs like really popped off after the extinction. And all those crocodile cousins that were doing really well before the extinction kind of had to take the backseat for a while. But there are still some really cool examples to go through throughout the Jurassic and mostly the Cretaceous.
Can you just remind me now, how far back are we talking? How many years?
So the Jurassic period, I always get fuzzy between the Jurassic and Cretaceous boundary because there's not a big extinction there. But so the Jurassic starts at around 200 million years ago, and then goes all the way through, we're going to talk about through the Cretaceous, so until 66 million years ago. So 200 to 66.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, and although for here, I'm going to be mostly talking, they're not going to be in any particular order time-wise for these ones here. Just some cool examples of croc cousins doing weird things that you wouldn't expect crocs to be doing. So there is one relatively small, armored, herbivorous crocodilian called Saimosukus, which was on Madagascar. Madagascar, even back then, was an island. And so islands are real weird. So it's like, was that an actual group, or was it just this one doing its weird thing because it was on an island? So we don't really know. I think, to my knowledge, we only have a head of Saimosukus. We don't really have too much of the rest of the body. To my knowledge, that might not be accurate to the last, the most updated stuff. But the last time that I checked, we pretty much only have a head.
Okay.
We also have a large group of marine crocodilians, or not crocodilians, but croc cousins. So not in the group that we have still today, still outside of that. And this was a weird because it's not like they didn't have competition. There were lots of marine reptiles around during this time. But these guys were like, hey, well, I'll sit down at the table too. Why not? So this group is called the Thalatosookians. Great name. One of the group, still sort of terrestrially adapted. They probably could come up on shore and probably lay eggs. But the other group, called the Metrioranchids.
Metrioranchids.
Yes. Were basically fully marine. Their front legs were turned into flippers. Their hind limbs probably still had some form of toes and digits visible. But what's really cool is that their tail was very long, and then at the end, like sort of kinked downward, which is what we see in sharks. So it's very highly suggested that they had like a fluke at the end of their tail, like a shark, like a one lobe on top and one lobe on the bottom.
Really?
Yes.
Really? Okay. What would be the purpose of that?
Just extra.
Not that things need to have a purpose, but
extra propulsion through the water, probably.
Okay. Oh.
And so these ones got quite big. Not super huge, as we'll talk about some of the crocodilian cousins later that got real big. But, 20 plus feet, not uncommon.
Okay. 20. So these are the ones, if your friend from Florida said you saw one of these, it was 20 feet. You'd believe them, except for they would need a time machine.
Yeah, for sure. One particular giant that you'll see if you look up biggest crocodile, this is one that will come up, even though it's technically not a true crocodilian. It looks a heck of a lot like it and was doing more or less what crocodilians today do, in that living in relatively shallow water and being a surprise predator. Except this guy was 30 feet long and 4 to 5 tons.
Absolute unit.
So
the United States government should be funding research into that, and I don't mean Fish and Wildlife Services. I mean the Department of Defense should be funding some research into bringing these guys back.
We'll talk about other ones as well, because this guy is not alone. So this is an animal called Sarcosuchus Imperator. So this is from the I believe the late Cretaceous of Africa and South America. And it had basically the modern crocodile body plan, where it had much more longer snout, and is essentially just, if you grab the corner on a picture of a crocodile and sort of drag it out to make it bigger, that's basically what Sarcosuchus is. But remember, so that is sort of just outside sort of the group of crocodiles and crocodilians that we have today. When we have everything that is alive today, the group Crocodilia, when they show up in the late Cretaceous around 90 million years or so. They are not the only ones around at the time. They have lots of cousins that hang on for quite a while, actually. And we'll talk about a couple of them once we get into sort of the more recent times. The split between the croc side and the gator side also happens very quickly around this time. Again, around 80 to 90 million years ago or so. So even when, crocs and gators from behind the head look very, very similar, they diverged a really long time ago.
From behind the head? Today, you mean crocs and gators from behind the head look similar?
Right. So it's like, if you were to, don't do this, please, but if you were to chop the head off a crocodile and an alligator, and then
just find one of those ones that they were testing the the breasts were, or just find one of those, because oh well.
But yeah, if you were to put their bodies next to each other, unless you really, really knew what you were looking for, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But despite them looking so similar, they are at least 80 million years separate. So this is just a body plan that works. Not because they haven't evolved any, They're just really good at what they do, and they hit on that plan early.
Mm-hmm.
The first fossil alligators, so true alligators, found around Europe and North America, which, the ones in Europe, you'll notice I did not talk about any alligators in Europe. They don't live there today. They show up around that time in both places. And one alligator cousin, so this is within the modern group that we have today, on the alligator side, was another giant one called Dinosuchus.
Dinosaurs. More great names.
Right? And it's exactly what, like I said, Sarcosuchus, how you just grab the corner of the image and sort of drag it up and upscale it. That's basically what Dinosuchus was, but for the alligator body plan. This one was around 35 feet and lived in a variety of United States. It's been found, I think there's 3 different species of it, and it's been found in a variety of places across the U.S. When it was alive in the Cretaceous, we've talked about before the Western Interior Seaway. There was this big, shallow ocean that cut North America into 2 sides. And so Dinosuchus lived on both sides of that great big seaway, and then also in a variety of places that are now the east coast of the U.S. So all over what is today southern North America on both sides of this big sea. So it's like if you're a 35-foot alligator, you can kind of swim wherever you want. Oceans are no barrier to you.
That's wild, though. Because you think of today, like the crocs and alligators seem like they're like pretty bound to areas where land is not too far away and the water
Yes.
isn't that deep.
Yeah,
but that wasn't the case here.
Yeah, that's true. Most of them are fairly salt intolerant. There is obviously the saltwater crocodile. That one is pretty much the only one known to spend like a lot of time out in the ocean. The rest like swamps, rivers, ponds, things like that. And it's also a big thing that they're not particularly cold adapted. I've seen it a couple places where it's like the American alligator is the most cold adapted crocodilian today, and they only get as far north as like very southern North Carolina. So
I had nothing to add for that.
Right. So they're very restricted in how far north and or south they can go.
Okay.
At least today. Back during the Cretaceous, when Dinosuchus was around, there really wasn't any ice on the poles, so it had no such problem. But the actual genus alligator that we have today appears in the Oligocene period, so around 25-ish million years ago, I think is the end of the Oligocene. So it appears sometime in that vicinity, probably a little bit older. I think it shows up in like early-ish Oligocene, somewhere closer to 40 million years ago. And just to show how much warmer it was back then, there are species ranging all the way from Nebraska and the Dakotas, that far north. Obviously, a crocodile or alligator could not survive today if you just kind of left it to its own devices. But 35 million years ago, it was a fair bit warmer than it is today, so they were doing just fine. In fact, we had some alligator specimens, the same genus, alligator, that had been found at Badlands National Park.
Wasn't that where you were at one point?
Pretty close. I lived about 45 minutes to an hour away from it in South Dakota.
Gotcha.
But there are much more. There's like a couple of species known from Nebraska and the Dakotas. There are several fossil species known from Florida, which makes more sense. The only species known within the actual genus alligator outside of North America is the Chinese alligator, which there are fossils of that particular species, but not really how it got there. So that's a little bit of kind of a mystery. I didn't really see too much in like when it diverged from, the other alligators, but kind of a mysterious thing just kind of out on its own over there in Asia.
Okay. Just Asia's doing its own thing. And you know what? We're going to let them.
Yeah. The caimans, also on the alligator side of the family, are only known, even as fossils, from Central and South America. So it seems like the alligator side did most of its evolution in North America and then sort of migrated south.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what the vibe that I was sort of getting with reading things. Although another giant, there is a giant caiman. So caiman are today most of the smaller crocodilians that we have. The black caiman is pretty big, about the same size as an American alligator, so 10-ish plus feet, not uncommon. But the rest of the caiman species are generally pretty small. Not this guy though. So there is a genus
When you
called.
say small, like how small is small?
So like I said, the Cuvier's dwarf caiman is the smallest crocodilian today.
So
And
6-7 feet?
I think that one is around 4 to 5 feet.
Oh, wow, even smaller. Okay.
Yeah.
So these guys don't fit into that. These next guys.
Oh no. So there is a genus called Perusorus, which is known from Peru, Colombia, Panama, and Venezuela, which was also around 35 feet. And this lived in the mid to late Miocene, so as recent as like 5 million years ago.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, which is crazy. Like, that is way too recent to be having 35-foot crocodilians. That makes me very uncomfortable.
Yeah, just a little bit.
And so caimans generally have a sort of more sturdy looking snout than alligators even do. So this was just a big beefy head thing. And so we actually had a replica of a Perusorus skull in our paleontology building in grad school. So literally every single day I walked by a skull of one of these things, and it's like, I feel like I could almost lay down inside of its skull. Not quite, but pretty close. This was a gigantic animal.
Right.
Just stomping around the Amazon only a few million years ago. The crocodile family, so that all was the alligator side. The crocodile family shows up in the Eocene period, so a little bit before we see evidence of the alligator side popping up. So that the crocodiles show up around 45 million years ago, so 5-ish to 7-ish.
Just any crocodiles at all?
The crocodile family, Crocodilidae.
Okay, but so like before this, it was all alligators, correct?
No, so the alligators show up afterward. Before this is when sort of other families within Crocodilia show up.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
So
the Crocodilia versus Crocodile is what was throwing me off.
Right. Yep. Yeah, and that's another thing with taxonomy, is that a lot of the names at different levels, which we talked about, are kind of fake, but are very similar, which can get confusing. But yeah, so the crocodile family shows up around 45 million years ago. But the actual genus Crocodilus, which is most of the crocodiles that we have today, shows up in the late Oligocene, around the same time that the alligators did. So around 35-ish. I guess late Oligocene would be closer to 25-ish million years ago. And they seem to be just doing regular crocodile things. These were not all that strange compared to today's crocodiles. One that I wanted to highlight from the fossil record, though, of the genus Crocodilus is a species called Crocodilus anthropophagus. Anthropophagus.
Oh, I think you said anthropophagus. But
nope.
Oh,
nope. So, yeah. So genus Crocodilus, species anthropophagus. Do you know what that means?
No.
It literally means man-eating crocodile.
Okay.
Not because it was particularly big. It was probably about the same size as like a Nile crocodile, maybe even smaller. but it was known from the Pleistocene of Tanzania, so, less than 2 million or so years ago. But it was found associated with human remains. So this is
What do you mean
direct.
associated with? What does that mean?
It is pretty confident that this crocodile hunted and ate this person. Maybe not hunted. I guess hunted is a bit strong. But there were feeding traces on a nearby human that match this animal. So it could have been scavenged. But like I said, there are very few crocodilians today that will actively hunt people. This apparently seemed to be one of them.
Okay. Wow. Wait, I mean, and this is no longer around, correct? This is years and years ago.
Right, but it's a crocodile. It's in the same genus as like the saltwater crocodile or the Nile crocodile. So it would look very similar to the crocodiles we have today.
Gotcha. Okay.
And like I said, there were some alligators or alligator cousins known to Europe. To my knowledge, that I was able to find, there were no crocodiles on the crocodile side from Europe. So it's weird. Every other continent, Australia, besides Antarctica. Antarctica's never really had crocodilians to my knowledge. But the Americas, Asia, Africa, Australia, they've all got crocs and, crocodile cousins, sort of. But Europe seems to just kind of not. And that probably comes down to it being cold, generally. So, like I said, crocodiles tend to have more of a problem with that than alligators do, which is why there are some alligator fossils in Europe. And that kind of covers crocodiles, a really weird group with a lot of ancestors that just do not look like them. And then some ancestors who look a lot like them, but giant.
Right. I was going to say, it seems like a lot of group that I'm of several minds on this that has, like, there's a lot of diversity and there's a lot of different things going on. And yet they all sort of come back. I don't know. I'm trying to think here if, as I was listening to you describe it, are crocodiles, or crocodilia, I should say, more or less diverse than I originally thought, because originally we were talking, you know it when you see it. And just hearing you describe all the different kinds, like it seems like there's one of the things, there's a lot of different flavors, but they all kind of tie back in together really nicely.
Yeah, and sort of the general crocodile body plan, like I said, is very successful. Just being able to sit nearby a shore, whether it's in the ocean, a river, a pond, and just sort of sit and wait for something to not notice you and get too close. That general lifestyle and body shape has been very successful in crocodilians, in crocodilian cousins, in giant amphibians of the past, before like reptiles even existed. That general body shape was really good. There are lots of other reptiles that are not related at all that also had this same body shape and assumed lifestyle. Even the first whales that started to become aquatic kind of have this shape. It's a very good way to eat things while also being able to function in the water and on land.
And I guess that's why they exist all across the world.
Exactly. And why that body shape has been so successful for so long and sort of accidentally perpetuated the stereotype of them being so ancient and archaic.
Well, speaking of things that are getting ancient and archaic, this has been episode 61 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. 61 episodes in. Never ceases to amaze me that we keep climbing that up. We should be back next week with episode 62, so tune in next week on Wednesday, and we will see you then. Take care, everybody.